electricity, where the question is no longer simply one of supply and demand, but of where industries will migrate, can the technology keep up, and who will shape the infrastructure of the next era of industry. In some parts of the US today, the influx of data centers have already pushed retail electricity prices significantly higher. Utilities are scrambling to add capacity, regulators are trying to play catch up, and investors are piling in order to finance the grids, building the grids and the generation that is needed to feed this digital beast. But there is a flip side to that narrative. Much of today's energy infrastructure planning hinges on lofty AI demand forecasts. One such forecast sees global electricity demand from data centers to more than double by 2030. That will equal to about Japan's total power consumption today. If those assumptions do not materialize, we risk overbuilding, we risk stranding assets, and therefore the paradox is, will AI eat the grid or will AI eat itself? I'm going to explore this landscape. We're joined by a distinguished panel here, Mr. Ashraf al-Ghazzawi, the EVP of Strategy and Corporate Development at Saudi Aramco, and Mr. Fred Thiel, the Chairman and CEO of Mara. I'm going to start with you, Fred, and ask you, we have this growing tension today between the exponential demand for AI and the speed at which we're building the clean energy and building out the grid. From your point of view, as one of the largest Bitcoin miners, which side is currently winning, supply or demand?
Well, I think demand is definitely winning at this point. There's a question of the characteristics of that demand, and I think we're going to talk some more about that a little bit later regarding flexible and inflexible load. But right now, the expectation is that AI will consume huge amounts of energy. And as you pointed out, the energy industry has not been building out capacity because demand has only been growing at about 2% a year over the past 20 years. And so it's a systemic shock. So definitely there is a need for building out additional supply. I think the bigger constraint is transmission capacity. But we're also seeing the large hyperscalers, the Metas, the Googles, Microsofts, and others, are even going into the power generation business themselves. They're starting to build gas-to-power facilities. And I think there are two risks. One is that the utilities don't want to overbuild. But at the same time, if the hyperscalers build so much energy generation capacity that they become utilities, as they become more efficient, what happens to the profitability of the grid? And I think that's the bigger risk, where AI could eat the grid.
We're going to explore that question further. Ashraf, we know that 80% of incremental energy demand globally comes from emerging countries. So the global south needs cheap and reliable energy. So that's on one side. On the second side, we've got these rising new industries, the AI and the data centers. That's concentrated in the global north currently. So how does Aramco look at your short-term decision making and your longer-term strategical planning when you want to address these two mega trends in the decades to come?
Well, I'll say that we don't see them as separate trends. When we go about developing our mid to long-term strategy, it's essentially answering the question, how much will demand grow and where the supply to fulfill that demand is coming from. So we really don't see them. I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's demand. We see it a little bit differently that, demand is going to win because you will not have demand without supply. I mean, somehow the supply is going to come from somewhere. And you're right, you obviously have to cater for, a global south or the emerging economies needs. You have this massive uprise in the demand from data centers. And that will have to come from somewhere. Now, how we go about our strategy is exactly that, looking at those trends and understanding what sources of energies will need it to supply them. That being said, I think the common thread between both sides of that equation is reliability. You won't allow economies to grow without reliable, sustainable, and affordable energy. And anybody who does AI and data centers know that the reliability is the name of the game. You have to be able to provide reliable energy to these data centers to unlock the full potential of AI.
Aramco, the name doesn't really ring a bell when people talk about AI, but you've been dealing with AI for many, many years and with its applications. We'll come to that later, and to your understanding of AI. Fred, beyond just building more power plants, some argue the real game changer is making demand itself smarter. How do you see technologies like AI, flexible pricing, co-location or co-located generation, in reshaping how energy-intensive industries consume power, industries such as yourself as a Bitcoin miner?
So the Duke University did a study earlier this year where they estimated that total demand for energy for the AI industry over the next few years would be roughly 48 gigawatts of power. They also said that there is 73 gigawatts of power available in North America today if the AI load was flexible for up to 2% of the time. So what does that mean? Imagine a data center that could modulate its load on the grid to the available amount of electricity such that the grid could maintain a flat load. And our industry is the world's best flexible load. And when you marry what we do with AI, you can essentially imbibe to AI a flexible characteristic such that instead of having to increment your peak capacity, you can operate within the existing capacity. Because the biggest challenge is not building generation, it's building transmission. Getting electricity from the generator to the load is the biggest problem globally. It's different in the developing world because it's easier to build. In the developed world, it's impossible. And so we focus on putting load at generation, behind the meter. A lot of what we do sits behind the meter at renewable sites. So we're able to avoid these congestion issues. But if AI can become flexible by marrying its technology with what we do, then all of a sudden there are more than ample areas, including in the kingdom today. We've been having these conversations with the Ministry of Energy to use the existing capacity without impacting peak.
Interesting. Ashraf, the natural gas, when we're talking about solutions to meet this demand, gas has witnessed a renaissance in the last few years, particularly with LNG, because it's so flexible. Aramco is working to significantly ramp up its gas production. We're talking about maybe 60% by 2030 compared to 2021. It's also growing its international gas business and gas portfolio. Is there a special role for gas in the energy mix when we're talking about AI and these new sources of energy demand? Does AI ultimately cement the role of gas as a destination fuel and not merely a bridge fuel, as was the narrative of the last decade?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, gas is now emerging as a strong source of energy to meet the growing demand. And it's exactly what you said. There's been a period where gas was seen as a transition or a bridge fuel. I don't think this narrative is there anymore. I think gas is here to stay and is actually viewed as a long-term fuel. For us, gas is probably the most exciting growth story that we have in our long-term strategy. And just to put it in context, when we say we're going to grow our gas business by 60%, in barrels of oil equivalent, by 2030, gas will become 6 million barrels of oil equivalent. That's half of our oil business. This is massive. I mean, what we're introducing in barrels of oil equivalent by 2030 is another large IOCs. And this is not only going to help energize the kingdom, energy demand, but also will unlock the potential for AI and associated data centers here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So globally, absolutely, gas is positioning itself as a very key enabler to the growth of demand associated with AI.
Fred, as AI moves from training to large-scale inference, energy demand will also be shifting from those concentrated data centers and more towards the applications, more towards the edge. How do you see this evolution reshaping how energy demand is consumed, and could inference AI change the very geography of energy demand?
Absolutely. If you think about AI, there are basically two things. One is you build and train models. The other thing is you then use inference to gain insights and actually derive value. So the profitable part of the business is inference. It's not the training. Training is kind of a lost leader, especially if you look at OpenAI today. If you think about that, the key constraint in inference, there are three. One is private cloud and sovereignty of data. For example, I'm sure Aramco doesn't want to put their seismic data out into the public cloud. They want to keep that close at hand. 70% of corporate data today still is not in the cloud. It's kept behind corporate firewalls. And so inference is something you run at the edge. You run it on site in the corporate world, because there's another constraint, network capacity. There isn't enough high-speed, low-latency network capacity, just like transmission in the electrical grid, to get your data to the cloud and back. And so you need to run it near-prem. So what that means, is that all of a sudden you will see data centers at the edge in the basements, if you would, of the Aramco towers. You'll see data centers sitting in the oil field, digital twins of drilling systems out in the field, which are essentially a digital version of the drill with all the seismic data guiding the drill operator, the master driller, as to where to put the drill. That's all operating at the edge. To do that, you have to have special infrastructure, but you're not talking about gigawatts of power. Inference doesn't need huge amounts of power. And the risk, I think, back to your original question, does AI eat the grid or vice versa, is you develop big models in the cloud, but the model you actually use in production is much smaller. And so over time, you're going to build intelligence out at the edge. And everything you use for production, supply, distribution of oil, distribution of gas, etc., will have an AI component that will run near or next to what it does. Now, there will be one type of inference which will be done in the cloud, and that is you have high security, high sovereignty, high privacy data you want to keep close at hand with low latency. But there are other jobs that may be production analysis that are kind of monthly reports. You may want to run that in very low-cost inference sites, which could be remote locations where the cost per token is the lowest. And I think that is the key driver in this business today, is the cost per token. You're spending all this money focusing on high-cost GPU and energy, when the real economic metric that you as a customer use is cost per token. And I want the lowest cost per token. So if I can essentially fragment my inference, low latency, high privacy close by, high latency, lower need for privacy, still sovereign though, more remote, low cost energy generation locations.
Ashraf, Aramco, we've mentioned before that it's been dealing with AI for many years in its different applications and forms. AI is both a major new consumer of electricity and also a potential tool to radically improve efficiency. So my question to you is, do you believe AI could meaningfully bend the energy demand curve moving forward at the back end of that curve? Or will its own appetite outweigh those efficiency gains?
So let me start by saying yes. I mean, we are not new to AI. We have been adopters and heavy users of AI for years. And that was built on top of a digital and computing infrastructure that was built over decades. We have our own 70 billion parameter large language model that we trained on 93 years of data. the example of drilling and how it's enabled by AI, actually, this is not something that we're going to do. This is already happening. You know, we're generating real-time logs for drilling activities that helps us minimize emissions and minimize costs of our upstream activities. So we understand what comes and what's associated with AI. So to your question, and I think like everything around us, efficiency ultimately will help, but it's not going to be necessarily from AI as on its own. You know, we've seen efficiencies help the world not consume the amount of energy that is supposed to be, so that, you know, energy demand is not growing, you know, in parallel or at the rate of global economy, and that is attributed to efficiency. And we see it the same thing. But it's not going to be AI alone. You will have efficiencies in the algorithms. You will have efficiencies on the computing platform. The chips themselves will become more efficient. And you will probably see efficiencies in the way data centers are designed and the cooling requirements in data centers. And I think all of these factors combined could lead at the end of the day to bending the curve, to your point.
Fred, in a minute, the surge in power demand requires massive infrastructure at unprecedented speed. What are the real bottlenecks there?
I think we talked a little bit about it. One of the bottlenecks is you have to generate electricity. That requires permitting, it requires land, it requires all sorts of things. Transmission is the other. You have to get the supply to where the load is. And I think the developed world, if you think about the US and Europe, it's very hard in those markets to develop new energy. They've spent over the past decade a lot of capital in building renewable energy. The problem with renewable energy, such as wind and solar, is it's intermittent, and it makes planning grid operations infinitely more difficult. You can look at different countries around the world either have huge energy shortages or some have actually electrical energy surpluses. I think the Global South, and especially the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is extremely well positioned because you have abundant low-cost energy, you have abundant land, you have a long-term vision in His Highness's Vision 2030, where you now have an ability to plan so that potentially the kingdom could be essentially a global hub for operating low-cost per token inference for those types of tasks that people are willing to put their data into a Saudi cloud versus necessarily a US or European or Asian cloud.
And this is where probably AI sovereignty comes. And we've seen the announcement, or heard the announcement yesterday, of Aramco and Humane. So a new venture for Aramco there. We've got seconds left on the clock. Ashraf, will AI eat the grid, or will AI eat itself?
I think that there is a happy, possibility here where actually, if it's done right and it's planned right, and people make deliberate investment decisions in infrastructure and in data centers, you could actually avoid this scenario, because it's the dollar per token, and people who invest deliberately and make all the right investment decisions based on their advantaged position. Saudi Arabia is actually at the heart of this, where you actually don't need to build overcapacity and make sure that there is the offtake and the demand side that is guaranteed.
So I know, like, Aramco doesn't like to hear the word stranded assets. Can we see stranded assets when it comes to AI-related power utilities?
Well, the answer lies in the dollar per token. Those investors that want to build, they make sure that they have the offtakes, they have the demand lined up, and that they make sure that they will be able to be competitive on a dollar per token scenario.
So hyperscalers, they should hold the risk.
They should hold the risk.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. A very interesting discussion. Audience, thank you for listening in. I hope it was all interesting to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Allah يعافيك.